The morning started like any other at Kensington Palace, but something felt different in the air. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood by the window of her private sitting room. Watching the early light filter through the ancient trees, she held a cup of tea that had gone cold in her hands, her mind somewhere far away. In the past months, everything had changed for her and William. The diagnosis had come like a thunderbolt, unexpected and terrifying. Turning their carefully ordered world upside down, William found her there, lost in thought. He didn't say anything at first, just placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. They had always communicated in these quiet ways, understanding each other without the need for many words. Catherine leaned back against him, drawing strength from his presence. The children would be awake soon, and they needed to be strong for them. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been their anchor through everything, their innocent laughter a reminder of what truly mattered. The palace staff moved quietly through the corridors, preparing for what would be an emotional day. Word had spread among them about what was being planned, and many had tears in their eyes as they went about their duties. These weren't just employees serving royalty. Over the years, they had become something closer to family, witnessing the intimate moments that the public never saw. They had watched the children grow, supported Catherine through her struggles, and stood beside William as he balanced duty with the desperate need to protect his wife. In the weeks following Catherine's cancer diagnosis, the world had watched with held breath. The announcement had been carefully worded, delivered with the grace and dignity expected of royalty, but behind closed doors, the reality was raw and frightening. Catherine had faced it with remarkable courage, but there were nights when the fear crept in. When she wondered about the future and worried about leaving her children too soon, William had been her rock, sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed during treatments, holding her hand through the worst moments, and somehow finding the strength to smile when she needed it most. The decision to step back from public duties had not been easy. Catherine had always taken her role seriously, understanding the weight of responsibility that came with being the Princess of Wales. But cancer doesn't care about duty or tradition. It demands everything, taking priority over royal engagements and public expectations. The palace had issued statements, asking for privacy and understanding, and remarkably, the public had responded with an outpouring of love that surprised even the most seasoned royal observers. Messages had flooded in from around the world. Handwritten cards from school children, letters from cancer survivors sharing their own stories, flowers left at palace gates by people who had never met Catherine but felt connected to her struggle. Social media, often a place of criticism and harsh judgment, had become a sea of support. People shared their own experiences with illness, offered prayers, and created artwork celebrating Catherine's strength. It was as if the entire world had paused to wrap its arms around this one family. What many didn't know was how deeply this support it affected both William and Catherine. They had expected sympathy, perhaps, but not this tidal wave of genuine love. Catherine spent hours reading the letters, tears streaming down her face as she realized how many lives had been touched by her simple honesty about her condition. She had been afraid to share her diagnosis, worried about appearing weak or causing concern, but instead, her vulnerability had created a connection stronger than any formal royal appearance ever could. William watched his wife's transformation during this time with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. The woman he had fallen in love with years ago at university had always been strong, but this was different. Cancer had stripped away the formal veneer that royal life often demanded, revealing something more authentic and powerful underneath. He saw her cry, saw her rage against the unfairness of it all, saw her gather herself each morning with determination that took his breath away. The couple had always valued their privacy, carefully guarding their family life from the relentless attention that came with their position. But illness has a way of breaking down walls. They found themselves needing support in ways they never had before, relying on family, friends, and staff in intimate ways that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Catherine's parents, Carol and Michael, had been constant presences, taking the children when treatments were scheduled, providing the kind of unconditional support that only parents can offer. King Charles, dealing with his own health challenges, had reached out with understanding that only someone facing similar battles could provide. Father and daughter-in-law had grown closer through shared experience, finding comfort in honest conversations about fear, hope, and the strange perspective that serious illness brings. The king had publicly expressed his pride in Catherine's courage, breaking with tradition to show emotional support in a way the monarchy had rarely displayed before. As Catherine stood by that window, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a relatively normal childhood in Berkshire to becoming one of the most recognized women in the world. She thought about her wedding day, about holding each of her babies for the first time, about the thousands of hands she had shaken and the countless smiles she had offered to crowds. But mostly she thought about what came next. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with treatments and hope and the ever-present shadow of worry. Yet standing there with William's hand on her shoulder, she felt something else too. She felt loved, not just by her husband and children, but by millions of people she would never meet. And somehow, that love had become its own kind of medicine, strengthening her for whatever lay ahead. The idea had come to William in the middle of the night, one of those sleepless hours when worry kept him awake. Catherine was resting, finally peaceful after a difficult day of treatment, and he found himself thinking about all the people who had reached out to them. The letters, the messages, the quiet prayers offered by strangers who somehow felt like friends. They deserved acknowledgement, deserved to know how much their support had meant. But how could they possibly respond to millions of people? How could they express gratitude that felt adequate for such an overwhelming display of love? William had always been thoughtful about his public role, understanding that every gesture carried meaning beyond the moment itself. He had learned this from his mother, Diana, whose ability to connect with ordinary people had revolutionized how the world viewed royalty. She had shown him that authenticity mattered more than protocol, that a genuine touch or a moment of real connection could change lives. Now, facing the most personal crisis of his adult life, he found himself returning to those lessons. The next morning, he shared his idea with Catherine over breakfast. The children had already eaten and were playing in the garden, their laughter drifting through the open windows. Catherine listened quietly as William explained what he was thinking. It would be simple, he said, nothing elaborate or formal. Just the two of them, speaking from the heart, acknowledging the journey, and thanking those who had walked alongside them. Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. She understood immediately what he was proposing and why it mattered. The palace communications team was brought into the conversation, though William made it clear this would not be a typical royal statement. There would be no careful political language, no distance between the message and the messengers. This needed to be personal, real, human. The team understood, though some worried about how such raw emotion might be received. The monarchy had spent centuries building walls between personal feelings and public duty. What William and Catherine were proposing would tear down some of those walls. And once torn down, they couldn't easily be rebuilt. Planning began in earnest. Though calling it planning seemed too formal for what was essentially a couple wanting to say thank you, they chose a location at their home in Windsor, a place that felt private and safe. Catherine wanted natural light, wanted it to feel warm rather than institutional. She had spent too many hours in sterile hospital rooms and didn't want this moment to carry any of that coldness. The technical team set up equipment minimally, understanding that less was more for what they were trying to achieve. Catherine's appearance changed during her treatment. Her hair, once so famously glossy and full, had thinned in places. She had lost weight, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup could soften, but not completely hide. Looking in the mirror as she prepared for the recording, she felt a moment of vanity followed quickly by defiance. This was what cancer looked like. This was reality for millions of people. If sharing her changed appearance helped even one person feel less alone in their own struggle, then vanity could take a back seat. William watched her prepare with admiration that bordered on awe. He had always known she was strong, but this was something beyond strength. This was courage in its purest form, choosing vulnerability when it would be so much easier to hide. He thought about all the times they had stood together in public, waving to crowds, attending state functions, fulfilling their royal duties. Those moments had required poise and presence, but this required something far more difficult. This required dropping all pretense and standing exposed before the world. The recording was scheduled for an afternoon when the light was soft and golden. The children were with Catherine's parents, spared the intensity of the moment, while still being the invisible presence behind everything their parents were about to say. William and Catherine sat together on a simple bench in their garden. The backdrop nothing more than the natural beauty of trees and flowers. No palace grandeur, no formal setting. Just two people in a garden, holding hands and gathering the courage to speak from hearts that had been broken and healed and broken. Again, over the past months, Catherine spoke first. Her voice steady, despite the emotion clearly visible in her eyes. She talked about the fear that had gripped her when she first heard the diagnosis. The word cancer landing like a physical blow. She spoke honestly about the treatments, about the days when she felt too weak to even get out of bed, about the moments of despair when the path ahead seemed impossible to walk. But she also spoke about hope, about the incredible medical team that had cared for her, about the love of her family that had sustained her through the darkest times. William added his own perspective. Speaking as a husband and father, watching someone he loved face a battle he couldn't fight for her. His voice cracked slightly as he described the helplessness of those early days, wanting so desperately to fix things and realizing he couldn't. He talked about learning to be present rather than protective, about finding ways to support Catherine that honored her strength rather than tried to shield her from reality. It was a remarkably honest admission from a man who had been raised to project control and confidence at all times. Together, they talked about the public response to Catherine's diagnosis. This was the heart of why they were speaking, the reason for choosing to be so open. They described reading letters from people who shared their own cancer journeys, from children who sent drawings of rainbows and hope, from elderly people who offered prayers and wisdom earned through their own life struggles. Catherine's voice broke as she mentioned a letter from a young mother undergoing chemotherapy who wrote that, seeing the princess face the same battle made her feel less alone. William spoke about how this experience had changed their understanding of their public role. They had always known intellectually that their position carried influence and responsibility, but this had made it visceral and immediate. The realization that Catherine's honest sharing of her diagnosis could provide comfort to others facing similar battles had transformed how they thought about privacy and duty. Some things were too important to hide behind palace walls. Even when sharing them meant exposing your deepest vulnerabilities, the couple wanted to be clear about something else too. This wasn't about them being special or deserving more sympathy than anyone else fighting cancer. Catherine emphasized that she had access to the best medical care in the world, resources and support that many cancer patients could never dream of having. She knew her experience, while difficult, was cushioned by privilege. The point wasn't that her battle was harder than anyone else's. The point was that cancer didn't care about titles or positions. It affected everyone, and in that universality, there was connection and shared humanity that transcended all the formal barriers that usually separated royalty from regular people. The most powerful moment came when Catherine and William addressed their children directly in the recording. This wasn't scripted or planned by any communications team. It emerged naturally from the emotion of the moment. From two parents thinking about the three small people who had been forced to grow up too quickly over the past months, Catherine's voice became even softer as she spoke about George, Charlotte, and Louis, about trying to explain to them in age-appropriate ways what was happening to their mother. George, at his age, understood more than his younger siblings. He had asked difficult questions that Catherine and William had answered as honestly as they could without frightening him more than necessary. He had been brave, taking on a protective role toward his mother that seemed beyond his years. Catherine spoke about finding him one morning sitting outside her bedroom door, unable to sleep because he wanted to be close in case she needed anything. The image of their young son keeping vigil broke something open in William, and he had to pause for a moment to collect himself. Charlotte had responded differently, becoming quieter and more clingy. She wanted constant reassurance that her mother would be okay, asking the same questions repeatedly as if different answers might emerge. Catherine had held her daughter countless times, stroking her hair and making promises she desperately hoped she could keep. The uncertainty had been the hardest part, knowing that children needed security and being unable to provide the guarantees they sought. All Catherine could offer was love and presence, being there as fully as possible for each moment they had together. Louis, the youngest, had sensed that something was wrong without fully understanding what. He had been more energetic than usual, as if trying to bring extra life and joy to counterbalance the worry he felt around him. His innocent questions and observations had often brought unexpected laughter during difficult times. Catherine shared how Louis had once told her that she was still beautiful even without as much hair, his child logic deciding that beauty must be about smiles rather than appearances. Such moments had been gifts, reminding them that life continued, and joy could still be found even in the midst of crisis. William added that one of the hardest aspects had been maintaining some sense of normalcy for the children while everything felt abnormal. They had tried to keep routines in place to celebrate birthdays and holidays, to make sure the children still experienced childhood despite the shadow hanging over their family. It had required enormous effort, but both parents felt it was essential. The children hadn't chosen this situation, and they deserved as much protection and normalcy as William and Catherine could provide. The couple also spoke about the broader family support that had surrounded them. Catherine expressed gratitude for her parents who had dropped everything to be available whenever needed. Her mother Carol had been particularly present, stepping in to care for the children during hospital visits and treatment days. She had also been a shoulder for Catherine to cry on, someone who loved her simply as a daughter rather than as a princess or public figure. That unconditional love had been a lifeline during the darkest moments. William spoke about his father with obvious emotion. King Charles, facing his own health challenges, had shown a depth of understanding and support that had brought father and son closer than they had been in years. Charles had visited Catherine in the hospital, bringing flowers from his own gardens and spending quiet hours just sitting with her. He understood the fear and vulnerability in ways few others could, and his presence had been comforting for both William and Catherine. The king had also taken time with his grandchildren, providing stability and love. When their parents were overwhelmed with medical appointments and treatments, Prince Harry had reached out from across the ocean. Setting aside family tensions in the face of something more important than disagreements or hurt feelings, Catherine spoke about a phone call that had lasted hours, during which old wounds had been acknowledged and put aside. Harry's concern had been genuine and immediate, reminding everyone that despite distance and difficulties, family bonds could still hold when truly tested. It was a small bridge being rebuilt, and while no one knew if it would lead to full reconciliation, the effort itself had meant something to everyone involved. Friends had rallied in ways both public and private. Some were people the world knew about. Others were part of William and Catherine's inner circle that remained carefully protected from public scrutiny. These friends had brought meals, taken the children for playdates, sent messages of support, and most importantly, treated Catherine as a person rather than a patient. They had reminded her of who she was beyond the diagnosis, maintaining connections to the life she was fighting to get back to. The medical team received special mention in their recording. Catherine spoke about the doctors and nurses who had cared for her with such skill and compassion. These professionals had seen her at her most vulnerable, had delivered difficult news, and provided hope in equal measure, had held her hand through procedures and celebrated small victories with genuine joy. She wanted them to know their work mattered not just medically, but emotionally and spiritually. The way they treated their patients, the kindness they showed even during routine tasks, made an enormous difference in the experience of illness. William talked about a particular nurse who had recognized him. Despite his attempts to be inconspicuous during one of Catherine's treatments, instead of making a fuss or treating them differently, she had simply smiled and said she hoped the princess was having a good day. That normalcy, that refusal to treat them as anything other than another patient and worried spouse, had been exactly what they needed in that moment. It was a reminder that the best care often came from treating people with simple human decency rather than special deference. Catherine wanted to address something else that had been on her mind throughout her treatment. She spoke directly to others facing cancer diagnoses, particularly women around her age with young children. She acknowledged that their circumstances were likely very different from hers, that many were dealing with financial stress, inadequate healthcare access, and fears she couldn't fully comprehend because of her privileged position. She didn't pretend to understand everyone's situation, but she wanted them to know she saw them, recognized their courage, and held them in her thoughts. The conversation turned to the concept of fear itself, something Catherine had spent a lot of time thinking about during treatment. She talked about how fear had initially paralyzed her, how the word cancer had seemed to block out all other thoughts and possibilities. But gradually, she had learned to live alongside the fear rather than be consumed by it. Some days fear won, dominating her thoughts and stealing her peace. Other days, she managed to push it to the background, focusing instead on small joys and immediate tasks. The goal wasn't to eliminate fear, but to refuse to let it be the only thing defining her experience. As the recording continued, Catherine and William made a decision that surprised even their closest advisors. They spoke about the specific type of cancer Catherine had been diagnosed with, sharing medical details that royalty typically kept private. This wasn't done casually or without careful thought. They had consulted with oncologists and cancer advocacy organizations, understanding that specific information could be genuinely helpful to others by naming the disease rather than hiding behind vague statements. They were removing some of the stigma and silence that often surrounded cancer diagnoses. Catherine explained that many people had written asking what type of cancer she had, not from morbid curiosity, but because they or someone they loved had received similar diagnoses and wanted to feel less alone. By being specific, she hoped to create more connection with others walking similar paths. She acknowledged that some might criticize this choice as oversharing, but she and William had decided that potential benefit outweighed discomfort. Breaking traditional royal privacy standards, William shared something that had surprised him during this journey. He talked about his own mental health struggles as he watched his wife fight cancer. He had always been an advocate for mental health awareness, championing various initiatives and speaking openly about the importance of seeking help. But he admitted that when crisis hit his own family, he had initially fallen into old patterns of trying to be strong and not showing vulnerability. It had taken Catherine herself, even while dealing with her own treatment, to remind him that asking for help wasn't weakness. He described seeking support from a therapist who specialized in helping families navigate serious illness. At first, he had felt awkward and resistant, questioning whether he really needed professional help when so many others had bigger problems. But the sessions had provided tools for managing fear and helplessness, ways to support Catherine without smothering her with worry, and space to acknowledge his own emotions without guilt. William's willingness to share this felt revolutionary for a member of the royal family. Particularly for a man who would one day be king, Catherine picked up this thread, talking about how illness affected entire families, not just the person diagnosed. She had watched William struggle with wanting to fix everything and having to accept that some things couldn't be fixed, only endured. She had seen her children processing fear in their own ways. She had felt her parents worry even as they tried to project confidence and positivity. Cancer, she realized, wasn't just her battle. It was something her whole family was going through together, each person carrying their own weight of fear and hope. The conversation turned to faith, a deeply personal topic that both Catherine and William approached with care. They didn't claim to have all the answers or even to understand why difficult things happened to anyone. But Catherine spoke about finding comfort in prayer during her darkest moments. Not necessarily praying for specific outcomes, but simply finding peace in the act of prayer itself. She talked about visiting the small chapel at Windsor, sitting in the quiet space and feeling connected to something larger than her own fear. William added that he had struggled more with faith during this time, finding it hard to understand or accept why Catherine had to face this battle. He had moments of anger that he was honest about, times when faith felt more like frustration than comfort. But he also acknowledged that the support they had received from people of all faiths, and no faith, had shown him something important about human connection and compassion that transcended religious boundaries. Whether people were praying for Catherine or simply holding her in their thoughts, The love behind the gesture was what mattered. They wanted to address something else that had been surprising and moving. Letters had come from people who saw themselves reflected in different aspects of William and Catherine's experience. Parents of sick children wrote about recognizing the same helpless worry in William's eyes that they felt every day. Spouses of cancer patients wrote about the strange guilt of being healthy when your partner was suffering. Adult children caring for sick parents wrote about trying to be strong while falling apart inside. The couple was struck by how universal these experiences were, how illness created a common language that crossed all boundaries. Catherine spoke about the strange gift that Sirius' illness had given her, an observation that might sound odd to those who hadn't walked this path. She explained that cancer had stripped away so much of what seemed important before, revealing what actually mattered. The royal duties that once felt pressing now seemed manageable to postpone. The public opinions that once caused anxiety now barely registered. What mattered was time with her children. William's hand in hers, a sunset through the hospital window, and the fierce determination to fight for more days, more moments, more life. This perspective had changed how she thought about her role as Princess of Wales. When she eventually returned to public duties, not every engagement deserved equal weight. Not every criticism deserved attention. What deserved focus was using her platform to make a genuine difference, to connect with people authentically, and to advocate for causes she truly cared about rather than simply fulfilling ceremonial obligations. Cancer had given her permission to be more selective and more authentic, something she intended to honor even after treatment ended. William nodded as she spoke, adding that watching Catherine's transformation had influenced his own thinking about royal duty. He had grown up knowing he would one day be king, carrying that weight and responsibility his entire life. But this experience had shown him that effective leadership wasn't about distance and formality. It was about connection and authenticity. The public response to Catherine's diagnosis proved that people valued honesty and vulnerability far more than they valued maintaining royal mystique. This would shape how he approached his role going forward. The couple took a moment to address the media. Walking a careful line between gratitude and boundary setting, they thanked journalists who had reported respectfully on Catherine's diagnosis and treatment, who had honored their requests for privacy during the most difficult moments. Good journalism had a role to play in keeping the public informed while respecting basic human dignity. But they also firmly stated that some boundaries needed to remain, particularly regarding their children. George, Charlotte, and Louis deserved as normal a childhood as possible, protected from the intensity of public scrutiny that their parents had chosen but their children had inherited. Catherine's voice grew firmer as she spoke about this. Her own childhood had been relatively private, giving her space to develop away from constant observation. She wanted the same for her children. Understanding this would be more difficult, given their position, but believing it was worth fighting for. The children hadn't asked to be born into the royal family. They deserved adults who would protect their well-being, even when public interest was intense. This wasn't about hiding them away, but about allowing them to be children first, royals second. The recording had been going on for longer than initially planned, but neither William nor Catherine wanted to cut it short. There was so much to say, so many people to thank, so many feelings that had been building throughout months of treatment and worry. The production team stayed quiet and patient, understanding they were witnessing something remarkable, something that would be remembered and referenced for years to come. This wasn't just another royal address. This was history being made in the most intimate and human way possible. Catherine turned to the topic of other cancer patients, particularly those who didn't have the resources and support she had been fortunate enough to access. Her voice filled with passion as she spoke about healthcare disparities, about people who delayed treatment because they couldn't afford it, about those who received their care in overcrowded facilities without the attention and dignity everyone deserved. She acknowledged that her experience, while difficult, had been cushioned by privilege in countless ways. This awareness had deepened her commitment to cancer research and support organizations. She announced that she and William would be establishing a new initiative, focused on supporting cancer patients and their families. The details were still being worked out, but the core mission was clear. They wanted to help bridge the gap between what healthcare systems provided and what patients actually needed. This meant funding for financial support during treatment, resources for mental health services for patients and families, and advocacy for better access to cutting-edge treatments, regardless of someone's ability to pay. It was a concrete way to channel the experience of her illness into something that could help others. William added that they had been humbled by stories from people in countries around the world where cancer treatment was even less accessible than in the UK. Letters had come from places where a cancer diagnosis was essentially a death sentence because treatment simply wasn't available or affordable. These stories had affected both of them deeply. It's making them realize that their platform could be used to draw attention to global health inequities. They couldn't fix everything, but they could use their voices to amplify concerns and support organizations doing important work. The conversation shifted to something more personal again. Catherine spoke about the moments that had sustained her during the hardest days of treatment. She described William singing to her when nausea made sleep impossible, his voice soft and slightly off-key, but perfect in its imperfection. She talked about her children drawing pictures that covered the walls of her hospital room, their artwork more valuable than any masterpiece hanging in royal residences. She mentioned the specific tea that a palace staff member brewed just right, the blanket her mother had made years ago that provided comfort beyond warmth, and the view from one particular hospital window that she had stared at for hours, finding peace in watching clouds drift across the sky. These small details mattered more than grand gestures. They were the building blocks of endurance, the tiny pieces of normal life that helped her remember who she was beyond being a cancer patient. Catherine wanted others going through treatment to know that it was okay to find comfort in seemingly silly things. If a particular television show distracted you from pain, watch it without guilt. If a childhood stuffed animal provided comfort, keep it close. Illness was serious and frightening, but survival also meant holding on to the small joys that made life worth living. William shared his own small moments of grace. He talked about early morning walks through the palace grounds when he couldn't sleep, finding unexpected peace in the quiet hours before dawn. He described conversations with palace gardeners who asked about Catherine with genuine concern, reminding him that many people cared about his wife as a person rather than as a princess. He mentioned the relief of making the children laugh, hearing their giggles and knowing that despite everything, they were still okay, still capable of joy. There was a particular morning William remembered vividly. He had been sitting outside Catherine's hospital room, exhausted and worried, when a young girl being treated for leukemia walked past with her father. She had recognized him and stopped, her eyes wide. But instead of asking for an autograph or saying something about Catherine, she had simply said that she hoped the princess felt better soon because being sick was really hard. That child's understanding, her empathy born from her own difficult journey, had moved William to tears. It reminded him that pain created connection, that suffering could open hearts to each other's struggles. Catherine picked up the narrative thread, explaining that throughout her treatment, she had thought often about what message she wanted to send when she was ready to speak publicly again. She didn't want to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. She didn't want to downplay the reality of cancer or paint an unrealistically optimistic picture. But she also didn't want her message to be only about hardship and fear. What she wanted, she realized, was to express gratitude. Gratitude for the medical advances that gave her fighting chance. Gratitude for the support system that surrounded her. Gratitude for each day, even the difficult ones. Because each day was still a day alive. This gratitude wasn't about toxic positivity or denying legitimate pain and fear. It was something deeper, a recognition that life was precious precisely because it was fragile. Catherine spoke about how cancer had taught her not to take anything for granted, not to assume there would always be time for the things she kept meaning to do. She had started living more intentionally, being more present with her children, telling William she loved him more often. In finding joy in moments she might have previously overlooked, William added that watching Catherine face this battle had changed him too. He had always known intellectually that time was precious, having lost his mother at such a young age. But this had made that knowledge immediate and urgent in new ways. He found himself less willing to waste time on things that didn't matter, more determined to prioritize what did. He had become more patient with the children, more present in moments, rather than thinking ahead to the next obligation. Cancer had taught him lessons he wished he didn't need to learn, but was grateful to understand. They spoke together now, their words overlapping slightly as they both tried to express the same thought. What they wanted people to understand was that their story wasn't special. All around the world, people were facing similar battles with as much courage and dignity as Catherine had shown. Single parents were undergoing chemotherapy while still caring for their children. Elderly people were fighting cancer while supporting sick spouses. Young adults were facing diagnoses that interrupted education and career plans. These people were heroes too, fighting their battles without the support systems and resources that Catherine had been blessed to access. The couple wanted to use their platform to shine light on these everyday heroes, to remind everyone that courage wasn't limited to people with titles or positions. It was present in hospital rooms and treatment centers everywhere. In the quiet determination of people who kept fighting even when the path ahead looked impossibly hard. By sharing their own story, William and Catherine hoped to honor all these stories, to create a sense of shared experience and mutual support that transcended individual circumstances. As the recording drew toward its conclusion, Catherine and William held hands more tightly. This final part of their message felt the most important and the most difficult to articulate. They wanted to speak about hope without offering false promises, wanted to acknowledge uncertainty while maintaining optimism. It was a delicate balance, requiring honesty about the reality that cancer's outcome couldn't be guaranteed, while expressing faith that good days still lay ahead. Catherine spoke directly to the camera now, her gaze steady, despite the emotion visible in her expression. She wanted people to know that her prognosis was currently positive, that treatment had gone as well as doctors had hoped, and that she was beginning to feel stronger. But she also acknowledged that cancer was unpredictable, that recovery would be a long process, that regular monitoring would be part of her life for years to come. She wouldn't insult anyone's intelligence by pretending everything was definitively fixed, or that fear wouldn't sometimes creep back in during the night. What she could say with certainty was that she was fighting, that she intended to be present for her children's lives in all the ways that mattered, and that she wasn't ready to let cancer define her story. The illness was a chapter, perhaps a significant one, but it wasn't the whole book. She planned to write many more chapters, filled with moments both ordinary and extraordinary. She looked forward to being bored at school concerts, to helping with homework, to arguing with William about silly things, to all the mundane aspects of life that now seemed precious. Beyond measure, William spoke about the future they were planning together. They would return to public duties gradually, being thoughtful about what commitments to accept and how to pace Catherine's re-entry into official responsibilities. There would be appearances at events they truly cared about, engagements that aligned with causes close to their hearts, and moments of sharing their family with the public in ways that felt authentic rather than performative. But there would also be boundaries, more protection of private time, and a rebalancing of duty and family that reflected their changed priorities. They addressed their children one final time, speaking as if George, Charlotte, and Louis were listening, even though the children were safely away from the intensity of the recording. Catherine's voice was tender as she told them they had been so brave, so understanding, and so loved throughout this difficult time. She promised them that while things had been scary, the worst was behind them now. She would still need to rest sometimes, would still have doctor's appointments to attend, but life was returning to something closer to normal. Most importantly, she was still their mom. Still there to kiss scraped knees and read bedtime stories and tell them. She loved them 100 times a day. William added that he was so proud of how their children had handled this challenge, how they had shown resilience and adaptability that amazed him. He wanted them to know that it was okay to have been scared, okay to still worry sometimes, and that both he and Catherine were always available to talk about feelings, answer questions, or just provide comfort. The family had been tested in ways they never anticipated, but they had come through it together, and that togetherness was what mattered most. The couple turned their attention to thanking specific groups who had supported them. Medical professionals received heartfelt appreciation for their skill and compassion. Palace staff were acknowledged for their loyalty and kindness during the most private moments. Family members were thanked for dropping everything to provide support. Friends were recognized for treating Catherine as herself, rather than as a patient or a princess. Each group had played a crucial role. William and Catherine wanted their gratitude to be specific and genuine. Most importantly, they addressed the millions of ordinary people around the world who had sent messages, offered prayers, left flowers at palace gates, or simply held the family in their thoughts. Catherine's voice broke slightly as she tried to express what this had meant to her. In her most vulnerable moments, knowing that complete strangers cared enough to reach out had provided strength she hadn't known she needed. Every card read, every message seen, every prayer offered had contributed to her healing in ways. Beyond medical treatment, William added that the public's response had reminded both of them why their role mattered. It wasn't about the crown, or the ceremonies, or the formality. It was about connection, about being part of a larger community, about the ability to inspire and be inspired by people they would never personally meet. The monarchy had survived for centuries not because of divine right, but because of the relationship between the royal family and the people they served. This experience had shown them that relationship at its best, and they were deeply moved by it. The recording couldn't end without addressing what came next. Catherine spoke about selective return to duties, choosing engagements that truly mattered, rather than fulfilling obligations out of mere duty. She wanted to focus her energy on cancer awareness and support, on mental health initiatives, and on early childhood development, causes she had championed before, but would now approach with renewed passion and personal understanding. Her illness had given her a platform to make real difference. She intended to use it wisely. William talked about how this experience would shape his future reign. He spoke carefully, not wanting to sound presumptuous about when he would become king, but acknowledging that lessons learned now would influence how he approached that role eventually. He had learned that strength included vulnerability, that leadership meant authentic connection, and that the monarchy's future depended on its ability to remain relevant and relatable to modern life. These weren't abstract concepts anymore, lived realities that would guide his path forward. They made one final appeal together. They urged anyone facing a cancer diagnosis to seek support, to not face it alone, and to remember that asking for help was not weakness, but wisdom. They encouraged people to talk openly about illness, rather than hiding it in shame or fear. They emphasized the importance of funding cancer research, supporting healthcare systems, and ensuring everyone had access to quality treatment regardless of their financial circumstances. These weren't just words, but commitments they intended to follow through on with action and advocacy as they prepared to end the recording. Catherine and William sat in silence for a moment, holding hands and looking at each other rather than at the camera. It was an intimate moment that the production team almost felt intrusive capturing, but it perfectly encapsulated what the entire message had been about. This wasn't a formal royal statement. It was two people who loved each other sharing their story with a world that had shown them unexpected kindness during the hardest period of their lives. Catherine turned back to the camera one last time. Her final words were simple, but powerful. She thanked everyone who had walked this journey alongside them, even from a distance. She promised to carry forward the lessons learned and to honor the support received by living fully and purposefully. She expressed hope that sharing their experience might help even one person feel less alone or find courage to face their own battles. And she said goodbye not as a farewell, but as a promise that this was just one chapter closing while many more remained to be written. William wrapped his arm around his wife as the camera finally stopped recording. The production team quietly backed away, giving the couple a private moment after such public vulnerability. Catherine leaned into William, exhausted but also relieved. They had done what they set out to do, shared their hearts in a way that felt true and meaningful. Whatever came next, whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced cancer, together. Supported by love that extended far beyond palace walls, and determined to find purpose even in pain. The farewell everyone felt wasn't an ending but a transition. Not a conclusion, but a continuation of a story that was still being written one day at a time.